Project Gemini paved the way for Project Apollo. It not only performed flawlessly, but it gave the American space program the experience of rendezvous and docking in space, as well as spacewalks. All of these were needed to successfully achieve landing on the moon. Project Gemini was the first American space program in which astronauts conducted EVAs. All Gemini spacecraft were launched using Atlas Agena rockets. These were two-stage launch vehicles. Once the astronauts splashed down and completed their mission, they were usually brought on board an aircraft carrier, and a battery of medical experiments were usually performed to check their body conditions after the prolonged space flights. This image, taken by Gemini 10, shows the Agena target vehicle. One of the primary missions of Gemini was to practice rendezvous and docking techniques. The Gemini spacecraft carried 2 astronauts. It was 3 times the volume of a Mercury spacecraft. This image shows technicians preparing a Gemini spacecraft for flight. This is an image of Gemini 8 with astronauts David Scott and Neil Armstrong. This picture was taken shortly after splashdown. On June 3, 1965, Edward White achieved his first spacewalk on Gemini 4. This image shows the astronaut using the jetpack, a thruster system which gave the astronaut the capability of maneuvering outside the spacecraft. All Gemini spacecraft were launched from Cape Canaveral, which was later changed to Cape Kennedy, Florida. This is Gemini Mission Control. This image is of Gemini 7, which rendezvoused in orbit with Gemini 6A in December 1965. This is an image of Ed White conducting the first extravehicular activity in the Gemini space program. Gemini 5 astronauts Gordon Cooper and Charles Conrad prepare for their August 21, 1965 launch. After completing 3 orbits in the 4-hour, 53-minute flight, Gemini 3 splashed down in the Atlantic Ocean. This image of astronauts Gordon Cooper and Charles Conrad Jr. shortly after their near-disastrous Gemini 5 flight. This image shows the comparative sizes of the Mercury space capsule and the Gemini spacecraft. This image shows a Gemini attitude thruster. This device gave the spacecraft the ability to maneuver in an X, Y, and Z position. This is a picture of the Gemini target docking adapter with its protective fiber shroud still attached. This is a picture of James McDivitt and Edward White shortly before their Gemini 4 mission. This is an image of a Gemini Titan 4 as it lifts off from Cape Canaveral, Florida. There were 10 manned Gemini missions between 1965 and 1966. This is an image of Ed White conducting an EVA which lasted 21 minutes on his Gemini 4 flight. This image shows a green dye marker which was used in Project Gemini to help identify the spacecraft once it had splashed down in the ocean.
In order to land on the moon, many technological challenges had to be solved. Project Gemini's goals were to control re-entry and landing with more precision than Project Mercury, and to develop spacewalks and vehicle rendezvous techniques. NASA decided to develop a two-pilot spacecraft. This spacecraft had to be capable of spaceflights up to 2 weeks in duration. The Gemini spacecraft had the characteristic bell shape of Mercury. The spacecraft weighed 8,400 pounds, over 2.5 times the weight of the Mercury capsule. The capsule had a 50% increase in cabin space over the Mercury capsule, and the hatch was changed to allow opening and closing in space for the astronauts to perform spacewalks. There were 10 piloted Gemini missions in 1965 and 1966 that included the first U.S. spacewalk and a series of successful rendezvous and docking exercises. Gemini continued the perfect safety record of Project Mercury and ultimately helped the Apollo program. Atlas, a single-stage rocket with one main engine, 2 booster engines, and 2 vernier engines, all powered by liquid oxygen and kerosene. Atlas rockets have been combined with upper stage Agena and Centaur to launch space probes, military payloads, large communication satellites, and weather satellites. Gemini 3 was launched on March 3, 1965, with astronauts Virgil Grissom and John Young aboard. During the 5-hour, 3-orbit flight, the astronauts performed engine firing maneuvers designed to change their orbital path. These maneuvers were important to practice if successful rendezvous were to be carried out. Virgil Gus Grissom piloted the second suborbital Mercury flight on July 21, 1961, in the capsule Liberty Bell 7, and in March of 1965 commanded the Gemini 3 mission. He died at the age of 40 in the fire that destroyed the Apollo 1 capsule on the launch pad in January of 1967. John Young Jr. flew on Gemini 3 and Gemini 10. He was also the command module pilot on the Apollo 10 mission that served as the important dress rehearsal for Apollo 11. Plus, Young was the commander of Apollo 16. Additionally, he commanded Space Shuttle Columbia's first mission in April of 1981 and the first Space Lab mission in November of 1983. Young was one of only 12 astronauts who landed on the Moon. Launched on June 3, 1965, Gemini 4 was a 4-day flight with astronauts Jim McDivitt and Edward White. This mission generated enormous public interest because of the planned spacewalk that was the first ever attempted. Using a handheld maneuvering unit, White propelled himself for 21 minutes on a tether line while traveling nearly 18,000 miles per hour in low Earth orbit. The mission also included a rendezvous with the second stage of the Titan II rocket. Edward White II was the first American to walk in space during the Gemini 4 mission in June of 1965. He died at the age of 36 in the fire that destroyed the Apollo 1 capsule on the launch pad in January of 1967. James McDivitt was the commander of Gemini 4. He also commanded the Apollo 9 mission, which was the first to conduct a test flight of the lunar module while in Earth orbit. Gemini 5 was launched on August 21, 1965. Its mission lasted 8 days and 128 orbits, briefly setting a world space endurance record. Astronauts Gordon Cooper Jr., the first person to fly in space twice, and Charles Conrad Jr. piloted this flight. For the first time, the fuel cells needed for longer missions were used to supply electrical power, but they did not supply enough. This prevented some activities from being carried out, although the astronauts were able to complete the rendezvous with an imaginary target. In 1965, Charles Pete Conrad Jr. flew on Gemini 5 and then commanded Gemini 11. In late 1969, he was the commander of Apollo 12. During this mission, he performed scientific experiments on the lunar surface and was one of only 12 astronauts who landed on the Moon. Conrad was also the commander of Skylab 2. Gordon Cooper was one of the 7 original astronauts of Project Mercury. In May of 1963, he orbited the Earth 22 times in a capsule named Faith 7. This was the first manned spaceflight to exceed 24 hours. In August of 1965, Cooper was the commander for Gemini 5. The launch of Gemini 6 was scheduled for October 25, 1965, but was canceled when the Agena target rendezvous vehicle exploded during launch. This left the crew, Wally Schirra and Tom Stafford, without a target. NASA decided to launch Gemini 7 first as a piloted rendezvous target for Gemini 6. Gemini 7 launched on December 4, 1965, and Gemini 6 was subsequently launched on December 15th. This marked the first meeting of two piloted space vehicles. Walter Wally Schirra, Jr. was one of the 7 original astronauts in the Mercury program. In October of 1962, he orbited the Earth 6 times in a capsule named Sigma 7 and later flew on Gemini 6. Then, in 1968, he commanded the Apollo 7 mission that tested all engineering hardware and systems from Earth's orbit. Thomas Stafford, Jr. flew Gemini 6 and Gemini 9. He was also commander of Apollo 10, the important dress rehearsal for Apollo 11, and Stafford was commander for the Apollo-Soyuz test project. Gemini 7 was launched on December 4, 1965, and the mission lasted 14 days. This represented the longest flight in the Gemini series. The objectives of this mission were to study the physical effects of long spaceflight on astronauts Frank Borman and James Lovell, Jr., and to act as a rendezvous target for Gemini 6. The two spacecraft were able to move within 1 foot of each other, close enough for the astronauts to wave to one another through the windows. Both spacecraft remained in this position for 20 hours and 22 minutes, while the crews practiced rendezvous maneuvers and formation techniques that were vital to the success of future Apollo moon missions. Gemini 7 astronauts spent 330 hours and 35 minutes in space, completing 220 orbits without long-term physiological problems. This mission proved that humans could endure lunar missions lasting up to 2 weeks. Frank Borman was the commander of Gemini 7 and also commanded Apollo 8, which was the first ever human-piloted flight that successfully completed an orbit around the moon. James Lovell, Jr. flew the Gemini 7 and Gemini 12. He was also the command module pilot for the Apollo 8 mission that was the first ever human-piloted flight that successfully completed an orbit around the moon. In 1970, he was the commander of the troubled Apollo 13 mission. Launched on March 16, 1966, Gemini 8 achieved the world's first docking with an Agena target vehicle. The mission, however, unexpectedly lasted under 11 hours. About 20 minutes after the docking, astronauts Neil Armstrong and David Scott reported that the two spacecraft had begun spinning rapidly. Although Armstrong was able to temporarily stop the spinning, it soon resumed, endangering both the spacecraft and the astronauts. Mission Control instructed the astronauts to separate from the Agena, but that made the Gemini 8 spin even faster, about 1 revolution per second. Armstrong and Scott soon began to have trouble seeing clearly, and the violent motion of the capsule made communications with the ground control nearly impossible. The astronauts were close to passing out as the vehicle continued spinning out of control. If they'd lapsed into unconsciousness, they'd have both died, and the spacecraft would have spiraled out into space. At the last minute, Armstrong broke a mission rule and ultimately saved their lives. He turned off the thruster system and activated the re-entry control system. Because of this, the astronauts were able to regain control of the spacecraft, but had to return to Earth shortly thereafter due to the loss of fuel. Gemini 9 was launched on June 3, 1966, with astronauts Thomas Stafford and Eugene Cernan. During this mission, NASA became aware of two potential problems that could arise. First, while Cernan struggled to put on his backpack maneuvering unit to use during his extravehicular activity, or EVA, spacewalk, he breathed heavily and his faceplate became fogged. The moisture couldn't be handled by the spacesuit air conditioner, and limited vision forced Cernan to terminate the spacewalk about an hour later without testing the jet-powered backpack. Also, plans for a Gemini 9 space docking failed when the Agena, dubbed the Angry Alligator, failed to open fully. Eugene Cernan flew on Gemini 9 and also the Apollo 10 mission, which served as the important dress rehearsal for Apollo 11. In 1972, he was the commander for Apollo 17, the mission that spent the longest time on the Moon, and was also the last Apollo lunar mission. He was one of only 12 astronauts who landed on the Moon. Thomas Stafford Jr. flew Gemini 6 and Gemini 9. He was also commander of Apollo 10, the important dress rehearsal for Apollo 11. Stafford was also commander for the Apollo-Soyuz test project. Gemini 10, with astronauts John Young and Michael Collins, was launched on July 18, 1966. A successful rendezvous was achieved with an Agena target vehicle 5 hours and 21 minutes after launch. After docking, the Agena's propulsion system sent both spacecraft to a new record altitude of 458 miles. During the 15th orbit, with the hatches open, Collins photographed the stars in ultraviolet light, something impossible to do below Earth's atmosphere. On the last day of the 3-day mission, Gemini 10 undocked from the Agena and rendezvoused with another Agena left in orbit by Gemini 8. To collect 2 scientific packages from the second Agena, Collins completed a 39-minute EVA by propelling himself to the vehicle with the handheld maneuvering unit. Splashdown with inside of the recovery ship ended this complex and tremendously successful mission. Michael Collins flew on the Gemini 10 mission and piloted the command module of the historic Apollo 11 mission that landed man on the Moon for the first time ever. John Young Jr. flew on Gemini 3 and Gemini 10. He was also the command module pilot on the Apollo 10 mission that served as the important dress rehearsal for Apollo 11. Plus, Young was the commander of Apollo 16. Additionally, he commanded Space Shuttle Columbia's first mission in April of 1981, and the first Spacelab mission in November of 1983. Young was one of only 12 astronauts who landed on the Moon. Gemini 11 was launched on September 12, 1966, with astronauts Charles Conrad Jr. and Richard Gordon Jr. aboard. After docking with the Agena, both vehicles broke the prior altitude record by propelling to an altitude of 853 miles. On the second day of the flight, Gordon initiated an EVA to find out how the Agena would react after undocking. As a result of the physical exertion of this EVA, his faceplate fogged up, and, like Cernan on Gemini 9, he had to terminate the spacewalk and return to the capsule. Later, the astronauts created gravity, 1.5 thousandths of normal Earth gravity, by tethering the two spacecraft and letting them slowly rotate around each other. This was the first time artificial gravity had been created in space. When Gemini 11 landed, it was the first time that an automatic computerized system determined the landing. In 1965, Charles Pete Conrad Jr. flew on Gemini 5 and then commanded Gemini 11. In late 1969, he was commander of Apollo 12. During this mission, he performed scientific experiments on the lunar surface and was one of only 12 astronauts who landed on the moon. Conrad was also the commander of Skylab 2. In 1966, Richard Gordon Jr. was a member of the Gemini 11 mission, and then, late in 1969, he was the command module pilot for Apollo 12. This mission performed scientific experiments and brought back lunar samples and pieces of the Surveyor 3 spacecraft that had landed unmanned 2.5 years prior. The final mission of the Gemini series, Gemini 12, lifted off on November 11, 1966. About 4 hours after launch, astronauts James Lovell Jr. and Edwin Aldrin Jr. rendezvoused with their Agena target vehicle. The most important goal of this mission was an extended EVA carried out by Aldrin. After about 20 simple tasks, many related to future repair of spacecraft, Aldrin set a new world record for EVA, about 5.5 hours. 4 days and 63 orbits after launch, the last Gemini mission made its re-entry and splashdown. In November of 1966, Edwin Buzz Aldrin Jr. set a spacewalk duration record for the Gemini project. His 5.5-hour EVA set a new world record. As the lunar module pilot in 1969 for the Apollo 11 mission, Aldrin was the second person ever to walk on the moon and is one of only 12 astronauts who landed on the moon. James Lovell Jr. flew the Gemini 7 and Gemini 12. He was also the command module pilot for the Apollo 8 mission that was the first ever human-piloted flight that successfully completed an orbit around the moon. In 1970, he was the commander of the troubled Apollo 13 mission.